Hello students, this is module 5.6.6, phylum Annelida, the segmented worms. On this first slide, we can see the various groups of segmented worms. There are really three groups. One group is represented by the two bottom pictures. Those are the leeches. In the upper right, we see the earthworm, which is probably the most familiar, and the most speciose and the most diverse group of worms is represented in the upper left, and these are the polychaetes, and they are all marine, and so many people don't know them, but they make up about 2/3 or so of all of the segmented worms. Let's look at the features of phylum Annelida. These are the segmented worms, contains the earthworms, the polychaetes, and the leeches. The body plan is these are segmented worms. They have segmentation externally and internally. They have three tissue layers, endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm. They have a true body cavity, and unlike the mollusks, which was the first phylum that we studied that had a true body cavity, and the mollusks didn't use that very well, they just had it reduced to an area around the heart, the annelids, the segmented worms, use their true body cavity very well. They have it filled with fluid, and that makes up their hydrostatic skeleton. The annelids also have a complete digestive tract, a separate mouth and anus. They have a closed circulatory system, which means that their blood runs in vessels, so they can have some blood pressure, allows them to be fairly mobile. We see some cephalization, more in some groups than in others. And we also have two features which are really important in classifying the three groups of segmented worms, and those are setae, which are little bristles of chitin, and then we have these flap-like appendages that are called parapodia, P-A-R-A-P-O-D-I-A, parapodia. And so some of these worms have one or both of these features, some have none. The skeleton within this phylum consists of fluid in that true body cavity, and so it's considered a hydrostatic skeleton. Feeding is various. There are many ingestive herbivores. There are some that are carnivores, or there's some that are scavengers. Some of the leeches are bloodsuckers. They're not considered to be true parasites because they just take a blood meal and then drop off. But nevertheless, they have an interesting mode of feeding, to say the least. The symmetry within this phylum is bilateral. So let's look at the three groups, and remember we're looking especially for these two features: setae, those bristles of chitin, and the flap-like appendages called the parapodia. And so we can see in the earthworms, they do have setae, but they are short setae, and they don't have any appendages. Now, earthworms may be both terrestrial and aquatic. There are different species that live in different environments, and so to call them earthworms and think them all terrestrial would be incorrect. Here is a photo montage showing various earthworms. This shows some of the giant ones. Here in the upper left, this is an Australian species, and you can see it's about 6 feet long, but it's not super large in diameter. This one from Ecuador, you can see it looks maybe as long, but it looks a bit thicker to me. And then we can see in the photos on the right, these are typical earthworms. In the middle bottom here, we see worms that are tubifex worms. These are aquatic worms. And you can see the red. They actually have a red respiratory pigment. Like humans have hemoglobin, these have something called hemoerythrin, which is a red respiratory pigment. If we look at these worms, this picture here is a scanning electron micrograph, and it actually shows the rows of setae. If you feel an earthworm, it feels kind of like the nubs, like someone who hasn't shaved for a little while and the whiskers have started to grow back. These are made out of chitin, and they actually allow the earthworm to grip. If you've ever seen a bird trying to pull an earthworm out of the soil, this is what it's holding on with, these little things, and they can hold on quite tightly. This shows just a photograph of an earthworm, and it shows this collar right here. This collar is called a clitellum. And when you're fishing, that's where you put the hook, but this is what an earthworm uses to secrete a mucus cocoon for mating. And earthworms are hermaphrodites. They have both male and female gonads, that is, they produce both egg and sperm, but they do practice cross-fertilization. So sex for an earthworm is a give and take affair. They both give sperm and receive sperm at the same time. And then they will lay their eggs in little cocoons secreted with the clitellum. And earthworms, of course, Charles Darwin did a famous study of earthworms in which he looked at how much soil they move and how useful they are for aerating the soil. And they do put a lot of organic material down into the soil. And earthworms, of course, many of you may know that they do burrow through the soil. They eat the soil and they will take nutrients out. And, of course, the feces of earthworms is made up largely of soil. And these are called earthworm castings. And they are very rich in nutrients. And earthworms don't only feed in this way. They will actually go up on the surface, grab a leaf or something to take it down and consume the leaf. So they do directly eat and introduce organic matter into the soil. Let's look at the second group of annelids, and these are the polychaetes. Now remember, we should compare these features to the previous in following groups. They have setae, but the setae here are long, and they have many kinds, and they're very abundant. As a matter of fact, the name polychaete, poly means many, and chaete is a form of setae, so it means many setae. And in addition to having long, diverse setae, they also have the flap-like appendages on each segment. So they have these paired segmental appendages called parapodia. All of the polychaetes are marine. They're quite diverse. There's two different types of polychaetes. There are tube worms, and then there are the free-dwelling polychaetes. And here we can see photographs of the two types. They make a tube, and they live in there. And they have this fan. Sometimes they call them fan worms. And here we can see the segmental parapodia, the flaps on each appendage, on each segment, not on each appendage. And so these are, the tube worms are typically filter feeders, and the free-living forms are often predaceous, but not exclusively so. Let's look at the third group of annelids, and these are the leeches. And here are two very interesting photographs. The one in the upper right shows a leech in someone's eye, which is really quite a grotesque thing. And then this guy he's looking very proud. He is a leech specialist, one of the world authorities, and he holds on his arm the largest species, a member of the largest species of leech in the world. And notice the features here, that they don't have any setae and they don't have any flaps. They don't have any parapodia. So they lack both setae and parapodia. I think it would be very useful for you to make a little table for these three groups, for the earthworms, the polychaetes, and the leeches, noting which ones have flaps, which ones have setae, and then maybe note some other interesting features. Certainly for the leeches, we would have to talk about the blood-sucking habit. And all leeches don't suck blood. Some are micropredators, things like that. But the ones that do suck blood, they have two types of chemicals. They have an anesthetic, which deadens your skin so you cannot feel them biting. And then they have an anticoagulant, which prevents your blood from clotting. So these two chemicals together allow a leech to really fill up when it's feeding. And so leech feeding, leeches are better termed as predators than as parasites. Down here in the lower left, you can see the Y-shaped mouth parts of a leech. And boy, they really make a Y-shaped wound, and then the blood freely flows because of that anticoagulant. Leeches also have suckers. They have a sucker on the front end and on the back end, and they can move like a slinky. Really interestingly. They also can swim in the water toward you. Land leeches will move on the land like slinkies toward you. It's really quite fascinating. The leeches are usually not host-specific, one species, but they're usually group-specific. For example, once when I was working at the university in a zoology lab as a teaching assistant, a student brought in a turtle, and it had a leech on it. And Dr. Harmon, who was our parasitologist at the university, he actually tried to get the leech to feed on him, a mammal, and the leech would not do so. And that's kind of typical. They'll stick to the same group, reptiles or amphibians or birds or mammals even. Now, notice that leeches have been in many movies. The African Queen and Stand By Me. Down here in the lower right are the actors, the lead actors from the African Queen. Do you recognize them? That man is Humphrey Bogart, and that woman is Katharine Hepburn. The African Queen was a boat they were trying to push through some rivers and little sloughs in Africa to get to a lake. And I remember one scene where he's in there, and I remembered that he was covered with leeches, and later when I saw it again, he just had a few leeches scattered there. A more recent movie is Stand By Me. This is based on a short story by Stephen King called The Body. Really a delightful little story. Some boys are traveling cross country, and they decide to cut through a swamp, and there's leeches in there, and they all jump out and they're pulling leeches off, and one little boy looks down in his shorts and he has a leech on his private parts, and he pulls it off. It's all bloody and he faints. Quite interesting. And there's been a number of B horror movies like Attack of the Giant Leeches that use these kind of invertebrates. But the leeches really are quite remarkable. They can withstand not feeding for a year or so. So before feeding, they can be really small, and after feeding, they can be really much larger. But remember, not all leeches are bloodsuckers. Some are just micropredators. In any case, we'll conclude this module, and we'll be looking forward to talking about the next group, the arthropods, the largest phylum of animals.